Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. It began with the sound of footsteps, faint and deliberate, echoing through the silent corridors of my grandmother's house. I was alone, or so I thought, and the heavy weight of unease pressed against my chest like an iron grip. The hour was late, the kind of late where the world seems to hold its breath, and even the creak of the old floorboards felt deafening. I had returned to the house for the first time in years, intent on sorting through my grandmother's belongings after her passing. She had always been a superstitious woman, warning me as a child never to wander into the back parlor after dark. It was her sacred space, she'd say, her eyes shadowed with worry. I never asked why. It felt forbidden in a way that made my young self instinctively shy away. But tonight, the footsteps were unmistakable. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking under the weight of my fear. The only response was silence. I should have left then, walked out of that house, and never looked back. Instead, driven by curiosity, or stupidity, I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the back parlor. The door to the parlor was ajar, though I was certain I'd left it closed. A draft pushed through the gap, carrying the faint scent of lavender and something else, something metallic and sharp, like rust. I hesitated at the threshold, my fingers brushing against the wood. The flashlight beam trembled as I pushed the door open. Inside, the air felt heavier, charged with an almost electric tension. The parlor was just as I remembered. Old, overstuffed furniture draped with sheets, a mantel lined with dusty porcelain figurines, and a large, cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the far wall. But what drew my eye immediately was the figure seated in the armchair by the window. She was cloaked in black, her head bowed, a veil cascading down to obscure her face. For a moment, I thought it might be a shadow, a trick of the light, but then she moved, so subtly I almost doubted it. "Ma'am," I whispered, though my throat felt dry and constricted. She didn't respond. I stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath my weight. My pulse hammered against my ribs as I inched forward. Something about her presence felt deeply wrong, like a chord struck out of tune. When I was just a few feet away, she lifted her head. The veil shifted, revealing a glimpse of pale, withered skin beneath. Her eyes, or the empty voids where they should have been, seemed to pierce straight through me. I stumbled back, tripping over a footstool and falling hard against the floor. "Leave," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves. The flashlight flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the light returned, the chair was empty. The woman in the veil had vanished. I bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart pounded as I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breath. What had I just seen? A hallucination? A figment of my overworked mind? As I stood there, the sound of footsteps returned, closer this time, deliberate and slow. They echoed through the hall, each step a chilling reminder that I was not alone. Desperate, I ran upstairs to the bedroom I had claimed for the night. Locking the door behind me, I slid a chair under the doorknob for good measure. My phone sat on the nightstand, but of course, there was no signal this far out in the countryside. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That I'd seen a ghost? The footsteps stopped just outside the door. My breath hitched as I heard a faint tapping. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound. A laugh, deep and mocking. And then silence. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with questions and half-formed fears. By morning, the house seemed almost normal again, bathed in the soft, forgiving light of dawn. I convinced myself that I had imagined it all, the result of exhaustion and grief. Determined to finish what I'd come here to do, I spent the day sorting through boxes in the attic. That's when I found the journal. It was tucked away in a wooden chest, bound in cracked leather and smelling faintly of mildew. Flipping through its pages, I recognized my grandmother's handwriting. The entries were cryptic at first, mentions of strange dreams, shadowy figures, and cold spots in the house. But then, one entry caught my eye. The woman in the black veil has returned. She watches from the parlor, her hollow gaze unrelenting. I fear she means to harm me, but I cannot leave. This house is hers now, and I am but a guest. My blood ran cold as I read further. The entries grew more frantic, detailing encounters that mirrored my own. The footsteps, the laughter, the warnings to leave. The final entry was dated just days before her death. If you find this, know that the woman cannot be reasoned with. She will not rest until she has claimed what she seeks. Beware the mirror. It is her gateway. The mirror. I dropped the journal and bolted downstairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The back parlor door was closed, but as I approached, I saw that same faint draft escaping from the gap beneath it. Gripping the doorknob, I hesitated. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind, but I had to know. I had to end this. The room was as I'd left it, except for the mirror. The cracked glass seemed to shimmer, its surface rippling like water. I approached cautiously, the flashlight beam bouncing off its jagged edges. As I stared into the glass, my reflection wavered and then disappeared entirely. In its place, I saw her. The woman in the black veil stood on the other side, her face pressed against the glass, her hands clawing at the surface as though trying to break through. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but the malice in her expression was unmistakable. I stumbled back, my heel catching on the rug. The mirror's surface bulged outward, as though something was trying to force its way through. A loud crack echoed through the room as the glass began to splinter. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I could feel her presence, watching from the windows. I never went back. I left the house to crumble and decay, a monument to whatever evil had claimed it. Sometimes in the dead of night, I dream of the woman in the veil. In my dreams, she stands at the foot of my bed, her hollow eyes unblinking, her whispers filling the room with dread. And when I wake, I swear I can still hear the sound of footsteps, always closer. The first time I heard the voices, I thought it was the wind, a faint, low murmur that drifted through the trees as if carried by an unseen hand. I remember standing at the edge of the woods that bordered my childhood home in Raven Hollow, Ohio, feeling that creeping unease, the kind that prickles at your skin when you know something isn't right. I was 29, back in town to settle my late father's affairs after he passed suddenly from a heart attack. He was found slumped over his desk, pen in hand, in the house I swore I'd never return to, the house that stood too close to the woods. That first night back, the house felt colder than I remembered. The old radiator groaned in protest, barely pushing back the November chill. I lit a fire in the hearth and tried to settle in, but the woods loomed beyond the living room window. Black, still, and watchful. That's how it always felt. Like the trees were watching. It was just past midnight when I heard it again, the whispering. Soft, unintelligible voices threading through the crisp air. At first, I thought it might be animals, maybe coyotes yipping in the distance. But no, these were words. Faint, fragmented sentences spoken in tones that sounded too human to dismiss. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the back porch. The beams of the light barely penetrated the darkness of the woods. "Hello?" I called, my breath puffing in front of me. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. No answer came, but the whispering continued, closer now, almost beckoning. I should have gone back inside. I should have locked the doors and ignored it. But I didn't. Something about those voices tugged at me, a magnetic pull that I couldn't explain. I descended the porch steps, my boots crunching against frost-bitten grass, and approached the tree line. The flashlight wavered in my hand, illuminating skeletal branches. "Who's there?" My voice sounded absurdly loud against the hushed murmurs. For a moment, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was as if the world held its breath. And then I heard my name, clear as day, a voice, raspy, guttural, and unmistakably male, called out from deep within the woods. "Ethan." My grip on the flashlight tightened. "Who is that?" I demanded, my voice trembling. But no one replied. Only the wind moved, rustling the leaves, carrying the faint echo of my name. I didn't go into the woods that night. Instead, I retreated inside, bolting every door and window. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again. Ethan. The next morning, I convinced myself it was a trick of the mind. Grief does strange things, I told myself. After all, I'd barely been back in Raven Hollow for 24 hours, and the weight of my father's death was still fresh. I spent the day sorting through his belongings, losing myself in the mundane tasks of boxing up his life. By dusk, the house felt suffocating. I needed air, space, something to clear my head. Against my better judgment, I found myself walking toward the woods again. This time the daylight was fading, the sky painted in hues of burnt orange and indigo. The woods looked less menacing, though the same unease curled in my stomach. As I approached the tree line, I noticed something strange. Footprints. They were faint but visible in the damp earth, leading deeper into the woods. They weren't mine, and they were too large to be my father's. The edges of the prints were smudged, almost as if whatever made them had been dragged. The whispering started again. This time I could make out snippets of words, though they were disjointed and broken. "Come. Find me. Alone." The voices overlapped, creating an eerie harmony that sent chills down my spine. "Who's out there?" I yelled, stepping into the woods despite every instinct screaming at me to stop. The flashlight's beam bounced wildly as I followed the trail of footprints. They weaved through the trees deeper and deeper until the house was no longer visible behind me. The air grew colder the further I went. The whispering intensified, no longer faint, but loud and urgent. "Ethan, hurry!" Panic clawed at my chest. I spun around, the flashlight catching glimpses of the woods, gnarled roots, twisted branches, shadows that seemed to move just out of reach. I wanted to run, but the voices wouldn't let me. They pulled at me, an invisible tether that kept me moving forward. The footprints ended abruptly in a small clearing. In the center was a wooden box, old and weathered, partially buried beneath a layer of moss and leaves. My breath hitched as I approached it. The box was about the size of a shoebox, its lid carved with strange symbols I didn't recognize. The voices stopped. The silence was deafening. The woods, so alive just moments ago, now felt dead. I crouched down, my hands trembling as I reached for the box. The wood was cold to the touch, and the symbols seemed to pulse under my fingers. When I opened it, the stench hit me first, rotting, acrid, and foul. Inside was a bundle of cloth, stained dark and wet. I hesitated, my stomach churning, but something compelled me to unwrap it. Nestled within the fabric was a bone. Not an animal bone. Too long, too slender. A human femur, cracked and splintered at one end. My heart thundered in my chest as I stumbled backward, dropping the box. The cloth fell open, revealing more bones, small, delicate ones that could have belonged to a child. The whispering returned, louder than ever. But this time it was angry. The voices overlapped in a chaotic chorus, screaming words I couldn't understand. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting and reaching like claws. I ran. I didn't look back, not even when I heard something crashing through the underbrush behind me. The whispers followed, chasing me all the way to the edge of the woods. When I finally burst into the clearing behind the house, the voices stopped. That night, I barricaded myself in the bedroom. Sleep was out of the question. I kept the flashlight clutched in one hand, a kitchen knife in the other, as if either would protect me. The whispering didn't return, but the silence was almost worse. Morning came slowly, and with it, a sense of dread. I needed answers. I drove into town, hoping someone, anyone, could explain what I had found. At the local library, I dug through old records and newspaper archives. That's when I found it. An article from 1973 about a boy who had gone missing in Raven Hollow. His name was Jacob Miller, 10 years old, last seen playing near the woods behind my house. His body was never found. I showed the article to one of the librarians, an elderly woman who had lived in Raven Hollow her whole life. Her face went pale when she saw it. "Those woods," she said, her voice trembling. "They're cursed. People hear things, voices, whispers. Some say it's the boy crying for help. Others think it's something darker, something that lures you in." "What happened to Jacob?" I asked. "No one knows. But they found bones, years later, scattered in the woods. Some say they weren't just his." I left the library feeling sick. That night, I burned the box and its contents in the fireplace. The flames crackled and hissed, spitting out black smoke that reeked of decay. For a moment, I thought I heard the whispers again, screaming in protest as the wood turned to ash. But it wasn't over. The next morning, I found footprints in the frost outside my window, large, smudged, and leading back into the woods. And faintly, from the tree line, I heard my name. Ethan. It started with the mirrors. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a passing shadow from the old maple tree outside. But when every single mirror in the house began to crack, not shatter, not splinter, but crack in identical jagged patterns, I knew something was deeply wrong. My name is Jake Holloway. I'm 32, and I moved into this house in Greenvale 6 months ago. It was a fixer-upper, the kind of place that whispered potential beneath layers of grime and neglect. The realtor called it charmingly historic. Translation: old, creaky, and possibly haunted. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not then. The first night the mirrors cracked, I shrugged it off. Maybe it was the house settling, or the humidity. But by the second night, the cracks weren't just cracks. They were forming shapes. Crooked, jagged outlines of hands, like they were trying to claw their way out. I told myself it was pareidolia, my brain finding patterns where there were none. But when I reached out to touch the glass, it was warm. Warmer than it should have been. The air in the house had changed too. It was dense, heavy. Every breath felt like pulling cotton through my throat. And then came the knocking, always 3 knocks, always at 3:03 a.m. The first time, it came from the front door. I stumbled out of bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing. The street was empty, the cul-de-sac eerily silent. I opened the door to be sure. The cold November air bit at my skin, but no one was there. No footprints on the frost-covered lawn. Nothing. I locked the door and told myself to go back to bed. The second night, the knocking came from the kitchen. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, against the window above the sink. I grabbed a flashlight and swung it towards the glass, but again, there was nothing. The third night, it came from inside the house. I didn't sleep after that. Coffee and adrenaline were the only things keeping me functional as I tried to rationalize the events. Maybe the old wiring was causing some kind of auditory illusion. Maybe I was just overtired. But then things escalated. The kitchen was the first to go. I woke up to find every cabinet door flung wide open, their contents smashed to the floor. Plates, glasses, and even the cast-iron skillet I'd barely managed to lift myself were scattered like some invisible force had gone on a rampage. The air reeked of burnt toast and something metallic, like blood. I cleaned up, muttering curses under my breath. But no sooner had I swept up the last shard of porcelain than the living room lights began flickering. I walked in just in time to see the couch levitate off the floor. For a moment, it hung there, suspended in midair before crashing down with a force that shook the entire house. I called a priest. Father Daniels was a no-nonsense man in his 60s with a voice like gravel and eyes that seemed to see through you. He walked through the house muttering prayers under his breath, clutching a small vial of holy water. When he reached the basement, he froze. "This place," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's marked." "Marked?" I asked, my throat dry. Something happened here. Something violent. The kind of thing that stains a place. He turned to me, his face pale. "You need to leave." Leaving wasn't an option. I'd sunk everything into this house, my savings, my time, my hope for a fresh start. But Father Daniel's warning stayed with me. That night, I slept with the lights on and a baseball bat by my bed. Not that I thought a bat would help against whatever this was. At 3:03 a.m., the house shook. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the halls as doors slammed open and shut, one after the other like dominoes. The temperature plummeted, and my breath came out in visible puffs. Then the whispers began. They were faint at first, just a susurration of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony of rage and anguish. "Get out!" they screamed. "You're not welcome here." I ran. My car keys were on the kitchen counter, but when I reached for them, they flew across the room, landing in the sink. As I scrambled to retrieve them, the faucet turned on by itself, gushing water that quickly turned red. Blood red. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted out the door and drove to the nearest motel, my hands trembling so badly I could barely keep the car on the road. The next morning, I called a paranormal investigator. Dr. Evelyn Moore was nothing like I expected. She was young, sharp, and skeptical. She arrived with an array of equipment, EMF detectors, thermal cameras, and something she called a spirit box. "This isn't a ghost," she said after her initial sweep. "This is a poltergeist. And it's angry." "Can you get rid of it?" I asked, desperation seeping into my voice. She hesitated. "Poltergeists aren't like traditional spirits. They don't just move on, they destroy." The next 48 hours were hell. Dr. Moore set up cameras and sensors throughout the house, and the poltergeist seemed to take it as a challenge. Furniture flew across rooms, doors splintered off their hinges, and every mirror in the house shattered simultaneously, leaving jagged shards embedded in the walls. Then it got personal. It started showing me things. Visions, I guess. I'd look at the walls, and suddenly they'd be dripping with blood. Faces would appear in the windows, twisted and screaming. And always, the whispers. Dr. Moore tried to document everything, but by the third night, even she looked shaken. "This isn't just a haunting," she said. "It's a manifestation of rage. Something here wants you gone." I should have listened. I should have packed my things and left. But I didn't. I was stubborn, stupid, and unwilling to let go of the one thing I thought could save me from my own failures. The final night was the worst. It started with the walls. They began to bulge and writhe as if something was trying to push through. The air grew so cold that frost formed on the windows, despite the heater running at full blast. And then the house roared. That's the only way I can describe it. A deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the house. The floorboards buckled, the ceiling cracked, and the walls started to bleed. Dr. Moore screamed as the spirit box emitted a burst of static followed by a single, chilling word. "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing only my wallet and phone, I bolted out the door, Dr. Moore right behind me. As we reached the street, the house let out one final deafening roar and collapsed in on itself. a cacophony of splintering wood and shattering glass. I stood there, shivering in the cold night air, watching as the dust settled. The house was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble. But the whispering, it didn't stop. It still hasn't. They warned me not to go into Blackthorn Woods. The way they spoke about it wasn't like a campfire tale or a whispered rumor. It was with a kind of visceral fear that made grown men look over their shoulders. But when the last person who ventured inside, the town's mailman, was found wandering the edge of the forest, naked and muttering gibberish, my curiosity became unbearable. I had to see it for myself. Looking back, I wish I'd listened. My name is Jason Hart, and I've always been drawn to places shrouded in mystery. I'm 29, a freelance journalist based in Portland, Oregon, and my career has revolved around uncovering hidden truths. So when I heard about Blackthorn Woods during a visit to the small town of Ridgeway, I knew I'd stumbled upon a story I couldn't ignore. The locals claimed the forest had been cursed for centuries, causing those who entered to lose their minds, or worse. The morning I decided to investigate, the weather was gloomy, as if the town itself was trying to discourage me. The sky hung low and gray, and a thin mist clung to the ground. Before heading out, I spoke to the bartender at the local dive, a wiry man in his 50s named Earl. He was one of the few who didn't dismiss my questions outright. "Blackthorn ain't like other woods," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "People don't come back the same, if they come back at all. You want to end up like Frank? Talking about shadows that breathe? You go ahead, kid." I shook off his warnings with a forced laugh. Earl just stared at me, pity in his eyes, and muttered something under his breath as I left. The entrance to Blackthorn Woods was marked by a rusted metal sign that read, "No trespassing." Beyond it, the trees grew close together, their gnarled branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. The forest floor was dense with moss and undergrowth, muffling my footsteps as I ventured deeper. At first, it seemed unremarkable. The air was heavy, but there was no immediate sense of dread. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at small animals scurrying out of sight. I began recording notes on my phone, describing the scenery and the eerie stillness. About an hour in, things started to change. It was subtle at first, an inexplicable chill, as though the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. The sunlight filtering through the canopy took on an odd, sickly hue, bathing everything in shades of yellow and green. I heard whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. But when I stopped to listen, there was nothing. "Just your imagination," I told myself. I pressed on, but the unease grew. The forest felt alive, as if it were watching me. The whispers returned, louder now, and I could swear they were saying my name. "Jason!" I spun around, my heart pounding, but I was alone. The trees seemed closer, their twisted trunks leaning toward me. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but the whispers didn't stop. Instead, they grew more insistent, more mocking. 2 hours in, I found something that made my blood run cold. A crude wooden totem hung from a tree, its surface carved with strange symbols. It was weathered, its string coated in moss, but what struck me was the way it seemed to pulse, like it had a heartbeat of its own. I reached out to touch it, and the whispers rose to a deafening roar. "Leave!" I stumbled back, my head spinning. For a moment I thought I saw movement in the shadows, a figure darting between the trees. It was too quick to make out, but its presence was undeniable. The rational part of my mind screamed for me to turn back, but I was too deep in now. I couldn't leave without answers. The forest seemed to shift as I moved forward, the paths twisting in impossible ways. No matter which direction I chose, I ended up back at the totem. Panic set in as the realization dawned. I was trapped. Night fell faster than it should have, swallowing the forest in darkness. My flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, its beam flickering as if the batteries were dying. The whispers were louder now, overlapping and chaotic, but one phrase cut through the noise. "It's your fault." I felt something brush against my shoulder and whipped around, shining the flashlight in every direction. Nothing. And yet, the sensation lingered, like icy fingers trailing down my arm. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. Silence. Then, a low, guttural laugh echoed through the trees. It was human, but wrong, distorted, as if it were coming from multiple mouths at once. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second I saw them. Dozens of figures stood among the trees, their faces obscured by shadows. Their bodies were gaunt, almost skeletal, and their eyes were glowing pinpricks of light staring straight at me. I ran. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I barreled through the undergrowth, my breath ragged and my heart pounding like a drum. The whispers turned into screams, a cacophony of voices shouting over one another. My own name, accusations and cries of anguish filled the air, drowning out my thoughts. I tripped over a root and hit the ground hard, my flashlight skidding out of reach. Pain shot through my ankle as I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight just as its beam dimmed to nothing. I was plunged into total darkness. Then I heard it, a wet, slithering sound, like something dragging itself through the dirt. It was close, too close. My hands fumbled for my phone, and when I turned on its flashlight, I wished I hadn't. The thing in front of me wasn't human. It was a grotesque mass of flesh and bone, its body twisted in impossible angles. Its face, or what was left of it, was a gaping void, and from within that void came the whispers. "Why did you come?" It rasped, its voice a chorus of agony. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The creature loomed closer, its form shifting like smoke. I thought it would kill me, but instead it reached out with one misshapen limb and touched my forehead. Memories that weren't mine flooded my mind. Faces contorted in fear, screams, blood. I saw people, countless people, lost in the forest, consumed by it. I felt their despair, their madness, their pain. And then I understood. The forest didn't just drive people insane. It fed on them, on their fear and suffering. It was alive, a sentient entity that thrived on torment. When I woke up, I was lying at the edge of the woods, my clothes torn and my body covered in scratches. My phone was dead, and my watch had stopped at midnight. Days had passed since I'd entered the forest, but I had no memory of how I got out. The people of Ridgeway avoided me after that. Earl wouldn't even look me in the eye. I tried to write about what happened, to warn others, but the words wouldn't come. The memories were too fragmented, too painful. But the worst part is the whispers. They never stopped. Even now, in the dead of night, I hear them calling my name, beckoning me back to Blackthorn Woods. And deep down, I know I'll go. Because once the forest has you, it never lets go. I never believed in ghosts. I thought they were just campfire stories meant to scare kids into behaving or staying close to home. But that was before I moved into the old neighborhood on the outskirts of Willow Creek. The playground at the edge of town had its own legend, and I learned the hard way that some stories aren't just stories. The first time I saw the playground, it was by accident. I'd taken a wrong turn on my way home from the grocery store. My GPS signal had vanished, leaving me to navigate the twisting roads by memory. When I saw the rusted swings swaying gently in the breeze, I slammed on the brakes. There was no wind. The playground looked ancient. The paint on the merry-go-round had peeled away, revealing a dull layer of rust. The monkey bars were jagged and uneven, their metal gleaming dully under the setting sun. The swings moved in perfect synchronization, though the air was still and heavy. I don't know why, but I got out of the car. Maybe it was morbid curiosity or just a sense of unease that demanded answers. Either way, I walked towards the swings, grocery bag still in hand. The closer I got, the more I noticed how wrong everything felt. The silence wasn't natural. No birds, no insects, not even the faint hum of distant traffic. Just silence. And then I heard it. A faint giggle, high-pitched and fleeting, like a child hiding just out of sight. I spun around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the playground was empty. My skin prickled as I realized the laughter had come from the swings. One of the chains creaked, the sound sharp in the eerie stillness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. I don't know what I expected, a lost kid maybe. But no one answered. Then, faintly, I heard it again. This time, it was a whisper. "Come play." I dropped my bags. The sound was right behind me, like someone had leaned in close to my ear. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the uneven ground. My gaze darted around, but I still didn't see anyone. I hurried back to my car, heart racing, and fumbled with the keys. As I started the engine, my headlights illuminated the playground. That's when I saw them. Shadows, faint but unmistakable, darting between the equipment. There were at least 3, maybe 4. They moved unnaturally fast, their forms flickering like static on an old TV screen. And then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, they vanished. I didn't stick around to find out more. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled onto something I shouldn't have. The laughter, the whispers, the shadows, they played on repeat in my mind. Finally, my curiosity got the better of me, and I started asking questions around town. Most people brushed me off, but one old man at the local diner froze when I mentioned the playground. "You stay away from there," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Nothing good ever comes from poking around that place." When I pressed him, he sighed and leaned in close. There was an accident there, back in the 60s. A group of kids were playing hide and seek when one of them fell from the top of the slide, died on impact. The others panicked and ran, but by the time help arrived, 2 of the kids were missing. They were never found. His story sent a chill down my spine, but I wasn't ready to let it go. "What do people think happened to them?" I asked. "Depends who you ask," he said, stirring his coffee absently. "Some say they got lost in the woods and died. Others think something took them. Either way, people started hearing things. Laughter, whispers, even seeing figures late at night. Folks started saying the playground was cursed, and it's been abandoned ever since." Despite the warnings, I couldn't resist going back. I don't know if it was stubbornness or stupidity, but I needed answers. This time, I brought a flashlight and a recording device, thinking I might capture proof of what I'd seen and heard. I arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The playground looked even more menacing under the pale glow of the moon. I stepped onto the sand pit, my footsteps crunching unnervingly loud in the quiet. "Is anyone here?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt at confidence. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, my flashlight flickered and the swing chains began to rattle. A voice, soft and distorted, echoed through the air. "Come. Play." Before I could react, my flashlight went out completely, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the buttons, but then I noticed something worse. Glowing shapes were forming around the playground. They looked like handprints, small and childlike, pressed against the equipment and the ground. Suddenly, the merry-go-round began to spin. The chains on the swings clinked faster, and the laughter returned, louder this time. It wasn't just one voice, it was several, overlapping and chaotic. I turned to run, but something cold grabbed my ankle. I fell hard, the breath knocked out of me, and when I looked back, there was nothing there. Just an icy handprint burned into my skin. I scrambled to my feet, but the shadows from before were back, circling me like predators. They were clearer now, taking on the shape of children with hollow eyes and wide, unnerving smiles. One of them stepped forward, tilting its head as if curious. "Stay," it said, its voice a chilling echo. "Play with us." My heart pounded as I backed away. "I don't want to play," I stammered. The childlike figure tilted its head the other way. "Then, you'll never leave." I ran, zigzagging between the equipment, but the shadows were everywhere. They moved faster than I could, cutting off every path. My recording device buzzed with static, and through the noise, I could hear faint screams. Real human screams, as if trapped inside the machine. Desperate, I darted towards the slide, thinking I could climb it and jump over the low fence. But as I reached the top, the air grew impossibly cold. The shadow children were at the base, staring up at me with unblinking eyes. "You can't leave," they said in unison, their voices blending into a horrific chorus. "You're ours now." I don't remember how I escaped. One moment I was trapped, and the next, I was running down the road, my legs burning and lungs heaving. My car was still parked where I'd left it, but the engine refused to start. I ended up walking home, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I got back, I noticed the icy handprint on my ankle hadn't faded. Worse, new marks were appearing, small childlike prints creeping up my leg. Now, every night I hear them outside my window. Laughter, whispers, and the faint creak of swing chains. I've tried to leave town, but no matter where I go, I see the playground. It's always there waiting, and the handprints, they're spreading. The first time I saw the Devil's Tree, I was 11. It was massive, ancient, and gnarled, its roots clawing into the ground like skeletal fingers. It stood alone in a clearing at the edge of the woods behind my grandparents' farm in Tennessee, its dark branches clawing at the sky as if trying to drag the heavens down. Everyone in town avoided it, whispering stories of curses and disappearances, but my friends and I dared each other to touch its bark. That night, I saw my first ghost. I'm 31 now, and I still can't think of that tree without feeling cold. For years I managed to bury the memory, chalking it up to a vivid imagination and a child's tendency to exaggerate. But last summer, I returned to that farm for the first time in decades, and the memories came rushing back. My grandparents had passed away, and the property had fallen into disrepair. When I arrived, the overgrown grass whispered against my legs, and the house creaked under the weight of neglect. But it wasn't the house that made me uneasy. It was the tree. It looked the same as it had 20 years ago, though the stories had only grown darker. Locals now claimed the tree was cursed, a magnet for death. Some said witches had used it for rituals long ago. Others insisted it was a gateway to hell. The stories varied, but they all agreed on one thing. No good could come from the Devil's Tree. I'd only planned to stay a week, long enough to clean up the house and meet with a realtor, but curiosity got the better of me. On my third day there, I decided to visit the tree again. The woods were quiet, unnaturally so. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching dry twigs. As I approached the clearing, the air grew colder. The hair on my arms stood on end. When I finally saw the tree, my breath caught. It was exactly as I remembered, impossibly tall, its bark dark as coal, its roots spreading like a web of veins. But something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was as if the tree was alive in a way that trees shouldn't be. I told myself I was imagining things and stepped closer. The stories were just that, stories. I reached out and touched the bark. It was cold, colder than it should have been under the summer sun. My fingers tingled as if the tree were leaching the warmth from my skin. That's when I heard the whisper. It was faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but it grew louder until it was unmistakable. A voice, low and raspy, calling my name. "Eric." I jerked my hand back and spun around, expecting to see someone behind me. There was no one. The woods were empty, still. "Eric." The voice came again, and this time, it was clear. It was coming from the tree. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. The voice grew louder, more insistent. The tree's bark seemed to shift, forming patterns that looked disturbingly like faces. They were twisted, anguished, mouths open in silent screams. I ran. Back at the house, I locked the doors and windows, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I dreamed of the tree. In my dream, its roots snaked through the ground, spreading like cancer, wrapping around the house, the town, the world. Faces pressed against the windows, mouths whispering my name. When I woke, the whispering didn't stop. At first, I thought I was still dreaming, but the sound was real. It echoed through the house, growing louder and more urgent. I followed it, hard in my throat, until it led me to the back door. The door was open. I hadn't opened it. Beyond the door, the woods were shrouded in mist, the devil's tree barely visible in the distance. Its branches moved, though there was no wind. "Eric." The voice was louder now, almost a roar. Against my better judgment, I stepped outside. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the tree. When I reached the clearing, the air was heavy, oppressive. The faces in the bark were clearer now, their eyes following me as I circled the tree. My heart raced, but I couldn't turn away. That's when I saw it. A rope hanging from one of the branches. It hadn't been there before. It swung gently, though the air was still. "Eric." The voice was all around me now, inside me. The rope twisted, and I saw it wasn't empty. It held a figure. A man, his face pale and bloated, eyes bulging. His mouth moved, whispering my name. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root. I fell hard, the breath knocked out of me. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The rope swung empty, but the faces in the bark were smiling. I don't remember running back to the house, but I must have. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, every creak of the floorboards making me jump. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of the light, anything but what it felt like. A warning. I decided to leave. The house could rot for all I cared, but when I tried to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. The engine sputtered, the battery dead. I called for a tow truck, but the nearest service was hours away. With no other choice, I spent another night in the house. That night, the whispering started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the house, pressing in on me. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voices grew louder, overlapping, a cacophony of anguish and rage. I could make out words now, fragments of sentences. "Help me." "Why did you leave? It's your fault." I couldn't take it. I grabbed a flashlight and bolted out the door, heading for the only place that seemed to hold answers. The devil's tree. The clearing was alive with movement. The tree's branches twisted and writhed like living things. The faces in the bark contorted in pain. The rope was back, swinging violently. "Eric." The voice was deafening now, a roar that shook the ground. The roots writhed, breaking through the earth, reaching for me. I froze, unable to move as one of the faces in the bark opened its eyes. They were mine. "Eric," it whispered, "you can't leave." The roots surged forward, wrapping around my legs. I screamed, fighting to free myself, but they held tight, pulling me closer to the tree. As the bark split open, revealing a dark, gaping maw, I realized the truth. The tree didn't just attract death, it consumed it. And now, it wanted me. I don't remember how I escaped. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling onto the road, covered in dirt and scratches, the whispering finally silent. The tow truck arrived an hour later. The driver took one look at me and shook his head. "You went near that tree, didn't you?" he said. I didn't answer. I left that day and never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whisper, "Eric," and I know the devil's tree hasn't forgotten me. It started with a watch that wasn't mine. I found it on my nightstand one morning. A sleek silver band with a black face and no numbers. The hands ticked normally, but it wasn't set to my time zone. I live in Minneapolis. and this thing was running 5 hours ahead. I assumed it was a gift left by my roommate Jake, but when I asked him about it over breakfast, his face went blank. "I didn't put anything on your nightstand, man," he said, stirring his coffee. "You sure you didn't buy it and forget?" I shrugged it off, but a nagging sense of unease stayed with me. The watch felt heavier than it should, almost alive. I didn't wear it, but couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Instead, I left it in my drawer and tried to forget about it. That night, I dreamt I was standing in a field of tall, golden grass. The air buzzed with static, and the sky was split down the middle, half day, half night. A clock tower loomed in the distance, its hands spinning erratically. The sound of ticking grew deafening until I woke up in a cold sweat. At first, I chalked it up to stress, but then the watch resurfaced. No matter where I hid it, in the garage, the attic, even the dumpster, it always reappeared on my nightstand the next morning, ticking away at its own rhythm. Then the slip started. It began with small things, moments that felt off but were easy to dismiss. Like when I left work one Friday and somehow arrived home on Thursday. I'd call it déjà vu, except the texts I'd sent and received the day before were gone. Conversations with Jake would rewind, word for word. He thought I was playing some weird prank, but I wasn't laughing. One Saturday, I decided to test the watch. I strapped it on, half expecting something dramatic to happen immediately. Nothing did, at first. I walked around my apartment, checked my phone, even tried meditating with it on. Hours passed, and I started to feel foolish for indulging the paranoia. Maybe I really was just stressed. But then I stepped outside. The moment my foot hit the sidewalk, the world around me shimmered like heat waves rising off asphalt. I blinked and everything snapped back into focus, except it wasn't my neighborhood anymore. The street looked older, like something out of a 1970s photograph. The cars were boxy and rusted, their colors faded. The air smelled different too, cleaner but tinged with something metallic. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, and ran back inside. Except my apartment wasn't my apartment. The layout was the same, but the furniture was different. Shag carpets, wood-paneled walls, a rotary phone. A woman I'd never seen before stood in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. Sorry, wrong place," I stammered, backing out the door. When I stepped outside again, the world shimmered once more, and I was back in my own time. Or at least, I thought I was. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Jake. "Dude, where are you? We're supposed to meet for lunch." I glanced at the time. Noon. But I'd just left my apartment at 10 a.m. How had 2 hours disappeared? Over the next few weeks, the glitches became more frequent and more disturbing. I'd see people walking backward on the street, their movements jerky, like a tape rewinding. Once I entered a coffee shop and found myself sitting at a table before I'd even ordered. My doppelganger looked up, locked eyes with me, and whispered, "Leave now." I obeyed. Jake started noticing things too. One night we were watching a movie when the power cut out. The TV screen flickered back on, showing footage of us sitting on the couch, but from an angle that wasn't possible. It was as if someone was filming us from inside the TV. Jake turned pale, muttering something about needing fresh air, and bolted. He didn't come back that night. The watch became impossible to ignore. Its hands no longer moved in a steady rhythm, but jerked and spun wildly, as if trying to tell me something. I tried smashing it with a hammer, drowning it in water, even burying it in the woods. It always came back, ticking louder than before. The final straw came when I visited my parents for the weekend. My mom was in the kitchen baking cookies, just like she always did when I came over. But something felt wrong. The room seemed slightly out of proportion, the colors too vivid. When I hugged her, she smelled like cinnamon, but there was something synthetic beneath it, like plastic. "Are you okay, Mom?" I asked. She smiled, but her expression didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, honey. Why wouldn't I be?" I tried to shake off the unease and went to my old bedroom to unpack. That's when I saw it. The watch, sitting on my childhood desk. Its face was cracked and the hands were spinning so fast they blurred. I picked it up and the room around me dissolved. I was back in the golden field from my dream. The clock tower loomed closer now, its hands spinning wildly. Figures moved in the distance, their outlines shimmering like mirages. One of them turned toward me, and I felt my blood run cold. It was me, older, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. "Stop wearing the watch," the other me said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not just tracking time, it's stealing it." Before I could respond, the world shifted again, and I was back in my parents' house. My mom stood in the doorway, her face blank. "Dinner's ready," she said in a monotone voice. I left that night, driving aimlessly until I ended up at a motel miles away. I didn't tell anyone where I was, not even Jake. I threw the watch into a river the next morning, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The glitches haven't stopped. Sometimes, I'll wake up in a version of my apartment where the walls are a different color, or Jake is a stranger. Other times, I'll see flashes of that golden field, the clock tower growing closer with each slip. I don't know how much time I have left, my time anyway. But if you ever find a watch that doesn't belong to you, leave it alone. Burn it, bury it, do whatever you can to get rid of it. Just don't put it on, because once you do, time stops belonging to you. And reality, it stops being real. The wind howled as if it carried the echoes of lost souls, lashing at the windows of my rental car with relentless fury. I parked at the edge of the gravel path, staring up at the weather-beaten lighthouse standing sentinel against the dark Atlantic waves. It was taller than I'd imagined, its cracked white walls bruised with moss and rust, and the beacon at the top no longer gleaming. The locals called it Dead Man's Light. I shivered, more from the stories than the cold. They said the lighthouse keeper, Samuel Hartwell, vanished one stormy night a century ago. Some claimed he'd jumped into the sea, driven mad by isolation. Others whispered he'd been dragged out by a shadowy figure that roamed the cliffs. I came here not to chase myths, but to find inspiration. Writing thrillers had been my bread and butter, but lately I was stale, an artist who'd lost touch with the spark that kept readers on the edge of their seats. I needed to be here, where history seeped from stone walls and whispers carried on the wind. As I stepped out of the car, the salt spray kissed my cheeks, and the taste of brine settled on my tongue. My boots crunched along the gravel until I reached the base of the lighthouse. A heavy wooden door stood ajar, groaning under the pressure of the wind. I pushed it open, the rusted hinges shrieking in protest. The interior smelled of damp and decay. My flashlight swept across the cobwebbed corners, illuminating wooden stairs spiraling upward into darkness. I felt a thrum of anticipation. Or was it fear? My writer's mind was already weaving possibilities. A hermit returning from the grave, a sailor's ghost waiting for redemption. I laughed, the sound hollow in the silence. I'd been here 5 minutes and was already scaring myself. I took a deep breath and started up the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. Halfway up, I paused, straining to hear over the wind. Was that the sound of footsteps above me? I held my breath, my ears ringing. Nothing, just the wind howling, testing the old building's resolve. I reached the lantern room, a wide circular space with shattered windows that allowed the storm to rattle inside. Broken glass glittered on the floor like malevolent stars. My flashlight caught a metal chair and a table, both bolted to the floor. On the table lay a diary, its leather cover warped and cracked. My fingers brushed over the initials burned into the corner. *S H*. Samuel Hartwell's diary. I opened it, the yellowed pages crackling as if they'd been asleep too long. The entries were scrawled in a frantic hand, describing his loneliness, the unending winds that screamed through the nights. and how he felt eyes on him when he climbed the stairs after sundown. I shivered, the hair on my arms standing on end. October 29th, 1898. One entry read: I woke to the sound of whispers. Not the sea, but something inside these walls. It called my name, low and insistent. I dared not answer, for I knew it waited for me at the top of the stairs, a shadow darker than any night. Suddenly, the wind's roar intensified, and the door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, my flashlight flickering. Panic surged in my chest, a hammering heartbeat that deafened me. I lunged for the door, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. "Who's there?" My voice quivered, the bravado I'd once had shriveling under an invisible gaze. The silence answered with a pulse, a rhythmic thumping that came not from my own heart, but from the stairs. Thud, thud, thud. Slow, deliberate steps ascended toward me. My breath came in short gasps, and my flashlight flickered out, plunging me into suffocating darkness. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, the only other source of light. The pale glow illuminated just enough to show me the top of the staircase. The air grew colder, pressing against my skin like the touch of frostbitten fingers. The footsteps stopped, and in their place came a low, guttural whisper: "Leave." The single word rattled in my skull, more forceful than the crashing waves outside. I stumbled backward, bumping into the table. The diary fell to the floor with a slap, its pages fluttering wildly before settling on the last entry, dated the night Samuel disappeared. It has grown bold. Tonight it stands in the corner, waiting. I can see its eyes like twin coals burning with the patience of the damned. A shadow moved across the beam of my phone's light, shifting like smoke, sinuous and purposeful. It solidified in the far corner of the room, a shape that shouldn't exist, tall with limbs too long and eyes too bright, glowing a fiery red. "Why are you here?" it asked, the voice echoing as if a dozen mouths spoke in unison. I couldn't answer, couldn't move. My throat constricted as fear coiled tight. I wanted to scream, but the sound died on my lips. "You have awakened me," it continued, taking a step forward. Its presence seemed to warp the air, pressing it against my lungs until each breath was a fight. I realized then that the stories hadn't done it justice. This wasn't just a ghost. It was a remnant of something ancient, something meant to be forgotten. Desperation fueled my next move. I turned and lunged for the window, crashing through the jagged glass, the storm roaring around me as shards sliced my arms. The world flipped as I tumbled down the slope of the cliff, cold seawater soaking me when I finally landed at the rocky base. Pain flared through my side, and darkness crept into the edges of my vision. Above, the lighthouse loomed, its beacon flickering to life for the first time in a century, casting an eerie red glow over the storm-tossed sea. In that moment, I saw it. The figure standing in the shattered window, its burning eyes fixed on me. I scrambled backward, rocks biting into my palms, and forced myself to my feet. My body protested, muscles screaming in agony, but I staggered toward the path that led away from the cliff. Behind me, the wind carried that same voice, low and insistent: "Leave." I didn't need to be told twice. I ran, the rain lashing against me, mixing with the blood that dripped down my arms. I didn't stop until the lighthouse was a distant silhouette swallowed by the storm, its crimson light still pulsing. A warning and a promise that it was awake now, and watching. Even as I collapsed in the car, breathless and shaking, I knew the story would haunt me, whispering its truths into my dreams. But one thing was certain: Dead Man's Light was not a place meant for the living, and those who dared enter its domain did not leave untouched.